The premise I was sold on tonight was someone needs to explain why movies aren't going to die, why they're not going to go away. And I thought, well, look, I understand the desire for a resurrection story. I think it's a good crowd for it. But in the spirit of, thinking for a change, I thought, challenge the question. And I think there's a really easy assumption to make at the moment, and that is that somehow cinema is going to die. Because I'll give you the tip, it's not. Feature films are not going anywhere. And I'll show you why in a moment. But look, you may not have thought this. However, I thought I should at least give you the voices of those who've said it. I mean, that great soapbox in the sky, Twitter, gave none other than Bret Easton Ellis, who is a famed novelist and written some really quite extraordinary books that have some made into films. He saw one show, HBO's The Night Of, and he wrote, HBO's The Night Of effectively eradicates the notion of the 2-hour American theatrical movie. There you go, rest in peace, bye-bye movies. He saw one show. That's good. That's fine. Quentin Tarantino just said cinema is dead. He said it at Cannes in 2014 because they stopped showing films with projectors and started using digital projectors. Cinema, dead, gone. It's now just TV in public. Okay? That's Quentin Tarantino. He holds a couple of extreme views, makes a couple of extreme films. This year, and this is what really prompted my thoughts this year at Cannes, Pedro Almodovar, a Spanish filmmaker, very impressive filmmaker, was the president of the jury. Huge controversy occurred when not one but 2 Netflix films were put into competition at Cannes. They actually have changed the rules of Cannes since this, because these films were shown at Cannes and then will go to Netflix. And the film distributors in France got so upset that they've changed the rules that you now must guarantee that there will be a cinema release of films if they are going to be in competition at Cannes. Pedro Almodovar went a step further. He held a press conference in which he, decried, and this was before the competition, and some people had issue with that. He said, I can never imagine a Netflix film winning the competition, just before he judged the competition with 2 Netflix films in it. But I'm sure they were surprised when they didn't win. But in this press conference, again, before, he said, these new forms should not take the place of existing forms like movies. Okay, apparently they're not movies anymore. They should not alter the habits of viewers. I find that fascinating. That sentence, they should not alter the habits of viewers. The Australian film industry did almost die in the 80s and 90s, and that was because they took that exact view, which is to go, look, the only way we're going to save the industry is to change the audience. I'll give you the tip. That has never worked for any business ever. You can't change the market. You go to the market. That's just basics. But thankfully, the Australian film industry has worked that out. They're actually beginning to thrive again. Pedro did say some great things. I then went on to say, as long as I'm alive, I'll be fighting for one thing that I'm afraid the new generation is not aware of, the capacity for hypnosis of the large screen for a viewer. Hypnosis of the large screen for a viewer. That to me is, in one sentence, probably the perfect argument I've got for my entire thesis that cinema's not going to die. But I thought, look, let's have a bit of fun. So, cinema is dead. There's death now. That's the 7th seal. Hands up who recognises this image? 1957? Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay. Who recognises these guys? Hands up? Yeah. That's Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. So it turns out in a matter of just under 40 years, Death went from playing chess to playing Battleship. Also Cluedo, some extra fun games in that film as well. Pop culture grabbed things. We know these. You just always went, oh, I know what these are. You know them because they were films. So Death, look, Oscar Wilde, I think, often gets paraphrased, and I'm just going to go for it again. The death of cinema has been greatly exaggerated. So we had the old men who were yelling at clouds. That's Network. Anyone recognise that one? Yeah. Do go and see that. This is, a character in Network in 1979 from memory. Came out, he's a newsreader, and he came and infamously said, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. He lost it on national television, decreed that the news was going to hell. It often gets brought out. You'll often see this clip get brought out. Unfortunately, in the film, it actually goes really badly for him. It goes very badly, then very well, then very badly. Great film. Definitely worth watching. Pretty much predicted what was going to happen to current affairs over the next 20 years. News, he was saying, was dead. News didn't die. It changed. And essentially, that is what cinema has always done. So, I want to take you back to 1896. This is essentially arguably, allegedly, and no, I'm not going to claim scientifically definitely, the first film ever made. It is certainly known as that. This is a train pulling into a station. It is by the Lumiere brothers, as I say, 1895, 1896, no one's even sure. In 1895, when this happened, I'm going to speak over it, you all screamed because a train just came at you and oh my goodness me. And that is legitimately what happened. People freaked out. 4 years later, Oscar Wilde sadly died. And I guarantee you the man who said that the reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, he probably by then had already heard cinema was going to die. Because, you know, they looked at this and went, actually I could just go and watch a real train pull into a station and really save myself the money. So around about then, cinema became all sorts of things. The longer cinema was actually first used for boxing films. You did get to see before 1906, which I'll come to in a moment, you got to see whole boxing matches were filmed. And this was it. People were trying to work out what to use this technology for. Then, and here's your patriotic moment, 1906, at 70 minutes, the very first feature film was Australian. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. It's the only Australian film I'm showing tonight, sorry. We're talking about the film industry as a whole, and that really will take us mostly to Hollywood. But yeah, the story of the Kelly Gang, 1906, was at 70 minutes, it was the first thing. And it was because someone went, narrative, story. This is what we need to be putting on films. In England and in Europe, they'd been putting plays that already existed. Les Mis, Richard III had already been put on. But this was the first film-made film, full story made for film. It went really well. Then, and now this will shock you, in 1915, the Americans made a feature film. It was called Birth of a Nation. It was hugely successful. Essentially, it sounds like a story that you'd hear in 2015, not 1915. It was made for $100,000. It made about $7 million. It ended up getting the first sequel, 1916. They made a sequel. But look, it shows that some things need to change. The heroes in this film were the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, that's how we all feel about that. That's okay because the people that they were beating up were in blackface. Oh, that's a bit awkward again. But, and here's, weirdly enough, one of the more concerning parts at the time was not those two really disturbing political choices, but in lots of these scenes they used close-ups. People argued at the time that if someone pays money for a ticket to a film, they're going to want to see the whole actor. So there was a lot of pushback against close-ups. This film, however, was hugely successful because it used close-ups. It used editing, it used a lot of the basic tools of film that were to come. So, hugely successful film. 1927. This is blackface, but this is, you know, probably the most famous example of it. This is The Jazz Singer. This was the talkies. Between various movies made about it, be they Moving Around in the Rain, or be they The Artist, I'm sure you've all sort of seen films that are set in that era. It wasn't actually as drastic a moment as either Singing in the Rain or The Artist will lead you to believe. It wasn't, you know, one day they were making silent films, the next they were making talkies. It happened over a matter of years. But The Jazz Singer was that first film that had a few moments of talking that were actually synchronized. It had lots of title cards that came up as well, and it had some music. And it changed everything. It certainly changed the lives, as the artists show, of some of the actors who'd previously been really good at essentially mimery, but, you know, was suddenly in a real bit of trouble when they had to lose their accents overnight. But Thomas Edison, you've probably heard of him. He didn't like them. He actually found it very stiff, the way that actors were moving when they had all the wires up them for the microphones. So he kept making silent movies for years. So the guy who invented the light bulb was apparently such an entrepreneur, he kept making silent movies. So films do change. People don't necessarily change it. But Thomas Edison, very visionary man, essentially was at the time saying, yep, cinema, dead. Movies, they're dead. They didn't die that time either. So then we get, from 1927, we get to, they started drawing things. Oh, my goodness me. That's right, it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, first feature-length cartoon. This, again, people freaked out because actors, they're no longer going to be necessary. Now we can just draw them all in. And as you know, since 1935 from memory, obviously they've never made a single film with an actor in it since. So none of the things that you've seen were made since that date. It's quite amazing what they did at the time. Okay, so 1935, Soon after this, 1948, the Paramount case happened in the United States. This was essentially a large action against the 5 studios. If you've heard of the studio system, what it was there were 5 studios that essentially ran the movie industry in the US and therefore in the world, even then. And what they did is they also owned the actual cinemas, and it was antitrust legislation was what they were going, which is anti-competition law. They used to sell them in blocks of 5, blocks of more. They used to force the cinemas to take films without actually seeing them. And so, weirdly, people said that we're just getting films that are made for profit, not for story. I remind you, 1948, not 2017. But the courts came down and said, you're going to have to break this up. There is a lack of competition going on. And so what they did was they changed their process, and they started, creating. They used, as you will have known, again, possibly from seeing films, they used to sign stars to studios. You weren't starting to a film, you were with one studio. They had to let all of that go because they weren't just making blocks of films anymore. Stars got a lot of power out of this. So soon afterwards, first we got a technology that, again, you may believe came from the early 21st century. 1952, Wane Devil, the first feature-length 3D film. 3D, as you may remember, was saving the industry 50 years later. So Wane Devil came out, and it was interesting, and there was a brief flurry of 3D films. Try to imagine that, if you will. I'm sure that it doesn't feel at all familiar. But so this was the first instinct they had. They'd lost their capacity to just dominate and tell the audience what they were watching. They had to listen to them. They drew them in with 3D. It worked a little bit. They also went with some very interesting marketing tactics. I'm a big fan of the lines over here. A lion in your lap, a lover in your arms. I'm genuinely surprised we haven't seen that tagline on more films in the 21st century. Or possibly we have, just more on websites. Okay, so after that we got the star system. Films went gangbusters because, of course, what happened was that each story had to rely on itself, but also rely on the stars. So Cary Grant made $700,000 in 1955 for To Catch a Thief. Alfred Hitchcock made $50,000. He made the film. What would he have to do with it? The reason he got $700,000 was because he got 10% of the gross profits. Gross income. He just got a huge amount of money just because what we needed now to get audiences in was the stars. Again, things are changing, but movies are changing, but they're still hugely important. We then get to One-Eyed Jacks, which is made a few years later. He got 75% of the net profits. It did well, not as well as To Catch a Thief, but he also got net profits, not gross profits. His agent wasn't as clever. But what was happening was that the industry was changing. We got some great films and we had stars, but these stars, he also produced this film because he'd also bought the script. So Marlon Brando is sitting there as an actor who's recognised that with the power he's got, he's going to start running the system. And so stars took over. Stars running Hollywood. Sound vaguely familiar? Yes, that's right. This is where it all came from. But then what was happening is that the studios still had a lot of control. They were making big epics. There we go. Big epics. We got the biblical epics of the time. We got the musical epics of the time. Big films because the studios were still determining what stories were going to be made. Eventually, the next generation got sick of it. Peter Fonda, who is the one who's not Dennis Hopper in this film, and the one who's not Jack Nicholson in this shot. Peter Fonda, who had a pretty famous father himself, was sitting in a hotel room in Canada, so the story goes, and he was having a drink of water and smoking a cigarette. Yeah, that's what was going on. And as he said, they're drinking his water and smoking his cigarette, he said, I'm just sick of it. I'm sick of these films that are supposedly for youth. And they featured Gidget and Doris Day. And this was 1969, well, 67 probably, when he was having the thought process in the Canada hotel room where he was very sober. And so they got together with Dennis Hopper and they decided to make a road movie. This is Easy Rider, 1969. It just broke every possible rule. He came up with this wacky idea, Dennis Hopper, that he would find music. When he was editing the film, he just turned on the radio and started editing to the songs that were playing. And that's how we got the idea of found music, which is now, you see it everywhere. Whenever you hear a rock song or a popular song being used in a film, before 1969 it basically wasn't done. You finished the film, you took it to a composer, and they wrote a score for it, or they got some classical music in, or they did something like that. This was changing things. Obviously, Easy Rider, for those who haven't seen it, it's definitely not one for the kids. Fonda himself said it was about driving across America, riding the biggest phallus he could find. And it was about two hippies who were traveling through America, trying to find the great American dream and getting lost along the way. And that is, it changed Hollywood because New Hollywood is a system that came out where what happened was the directors started writing the stories, not the studios, and then bringing them to the studio. So once again, films changed remarkably. Because instead of the studios going, we want a film about the Bible, we want a film about people singing, someone said, I've made a film, or I'm making a film about two guys who are crossing America, but you are going to find millions of people who want to watch it. And they did. This film went berserk. It basically, until Blair Witch Project, I think it held a lot of box office records for percentage of cost compared to income. So it's a hugely successful film. Then, you know, the times, they changed again. I don't know if you recognise these guys. Small film, independent, didn't go very far. 1977, and what's happened is that the studios have worked out, okay, well, this New Hollywood, that's fantastic, but we still sort of really want to, go a little bit higher. This is where we got toys. George Lucas famously didn't take a fee on Star Wars: A New Hope, or just Star Wars as it was then. He didn't need to. He just said, okay, you can have my fee, can I just keep the merchandising rights? Yeah, and you laugh now. The studios laughed at him and signed very happily, because they didn't see the point of merchandising rights. Movies didn't have merchandise back then. The next Star Wars film was built and paid for on those merchandising rights, because this was an independent film, as Fox obviously learnt when they realised that someone else could just go and sell it to Disney many years later for billions of dollars. But what you got with Star Wars was, of course, that and Jaws were the two grandparents of the blockbuster era. And that is what is often held up to be what is dying. I'm not sure I even agree with that, and we'll come to that. But it's really interesting to see that it was 1977. Films had been doing really well until then. The only reason these came along was because in the 1920, the number of tickets sold in North America was about 100 million. In 1960, it was 20 million. Cinema already died. It died around the 30s and the 40s. But it keeps coming back because they keep reinventing itself with things like Star Wars. Then, of course, the 80s happened. We get Max Headroom. Oh, hello, television. Television first killed cinema in 1952. Just so you're aware, that was the official rest in peace moment, apparently. Television, when it came along, was part of that 30s and 40s and 50s that just knocked off ticket sales. And it's what caused the blockbuster. Because once you had Max Headroom, who was made on a computer, probably a Commodore 64, once he was being made and on televisions at home as the face of MTV, then the studios had to make Star Wars. The studios had to make Jaws because they had to lure you out of your home. This is what's going to happen again, in case you're wondering. So then, here's a big change. 1995, Toy Story comes out. What's the big difference? Remember that moment where we stopped having actors because we started drawing them? We stopped drawing them now. Now they're being made by computers. This was the first film that was computer animated. So we didn't need artists anymore. Basically, probably just run a program, don't you? It's very cheap to make these films, I'm led to believe. So Pixar came along and they delivered Toy Story, and it was fantastic. Then The Matrix. Why is this up here? Well, obviously, great film. Also 1999. This is pretty much the face of DVD. DVD, killed off cinema. It's dead now. Absolutely gone. You will never see it again. Also, don't remember the code, it represented the internet. Internet, definitely killing cinema. Been a lot of deaths so far. 2008, Slumdog Millionaire. This is really interesting. This is the first Oscar for cinematography that went to a digital film, shot entirely on digital. Hadn't happened before because cinema was busy dying. Don't know if you remember. Quentin Tarantino, years after this, said if you don't make it on film, it's not film. Well, so literally speaking, that's true, if you like your syllogism. But other than that, that's just won the Oscar for cinematography being shot digitally. Obviously, I could have shown you Star Wars Episode 2, but I don't want to do that. There's Avatar. Look, this is a huge franchise. It's broken $2 billion in 2009. I don't think this is a dying industry at this point. We've got 3 sequels being made at the moment. It's also got a Cirque du Soleil. I mean, if you're talking about franchising and merchandising, it's not a bad little act. They're going terribly well, these films, at this point as they die. And then, of course, we get the Iron Men. I thought I'd use this shot of multiple Iron Men because really that's what the entire Marvel universe is. And it's just lots and lots of the same thing, but we love to go and see them because of escapism. So, look, that's the history. There's a little way to go. Look, in terms of where we get to now, that is a super pig. That's Okja. who was one of the 2 Netflix films that, you know, was in competition at Cannes and also was the closing night of Sydney Film Festival. Sydney Film Festival this year had its highest ticket sales ever. It was on more screens, got more people. It's grown year on year for 10 years. That's Sydney Film Festival. Cannes Film Festival was upset they were showing this because its brand was being lent to a Netflix film. Cannes Film Festival is a brand. Sydney Film Festival is a brand now. The industries are changing. They're not dying. If you've got Sydney Film Festival being bigger than it ever was, I don't think that films are dying. They're just not the same. We can't show you the shot of the train pulling into the train station and expect you to get excited. Super Pigs, on the other hand, that's excellent. Do go and see that. Well, get Netflix. But what about the future? Well, she's a reasonable representation of this. Wonder Woman. I don't know if you saw, there were just some great stories that came out of this. And look, there's some other stuff I'd love to say. I'll probably bring it up in the Q&As. But this, to me, was the great story that came out. Was when Wonder Woman, this is only the 2nd big action film directed by a female director. But all the stories, like there are films that have done better in the box office this year. Beauty and the Beast has passed $1 billion. We've got a few others that have done it. But days after this, you had little girls and little boys even dressing up as Wonder Woman at school. She's replaced Frozen. The fact that she replaced Frozen means that a film replaced a film. Pop culture is still so rooted in these things. The thing that I suppose I need to finish on is essentially, okay, the future for me. Break film up. If you're going to say film's going to die, identify for me which film. You're talking about independent, small films? So you're telling me that the fact that Birdman was the last studio film to win Best Picture means, which was, you know, obviously a major film, but since then we've had Spotlight and Moonlight, which apart from sounding like some sort of weird poetry, neither of those were studio films. They're small indie films that have won Best Picture at the Oscars. What about the middle films? George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, about a year ago, came out, might have been 2 years ago, came out and said that the middle-sized films are the ones that are dying. I think that's true in 2 ways. One, middle-sized films was when they're talking about films with budgets 30 to 50 million kind of things. That used to be the sweet spot of cinema. The costs have disappeared. You don't need to shoot on film anymore. We all carry around the capacity to shoot, edit, and see a feature film in our pocket. So you don't need $30 to $50 million unless you're going to start going to visual effects or big actors. And that's a legitimate thing to do. But then you're drifting into blockbusters. So this is the area that, yes, is challenged by the likes of, you know, The Wire and all the golden age of television. But television's taking an awful long time to kill movies. It's been trying since 1952. I don't think it's going to get all of them, because then you get to blockbusters, then you get to Wonder Woman, then you get to Marvel. Star Wars was the biggest film out last year. Star Wars was the biggest film out the year before. By the end of this year, I've got a tip for you as to what will be the biggest film. The blockbusters are still making over $1 billion a year when they do well. Some of them don't. But if you tell me that the biggest problem with Batman versus Superman is that the movies are dying, I'm going to start saying maybe it's the movie, not the entire industry, not the entire format that's dying. So look, I'm a big fan of challenging the idea. I'm sorry that I've really just taken an entire speech to challenge the question. Why are movies dying? Will movies survive? Movies aren't dying. Movies will survive. We will change, movies will change, but unless you're Pedro Almodovar and determined to change the audience back, I think everyone's quite safe. So, thank you very much. Sorry, I just realised I left out one joke, and that's this. But anyway, if you're wondering why a certain radio DJ went past, it was because the Buggles represent my philosophy. 1979, video killed the radio star. Yet you all know who that is, don't you? But the good news is there's a better radio star, and it's Christian Slater in Pump Up the Volume, and I'm pretty sure that's who he was trying to be. Thank you very much.